A Scottish broadsword glints in the Italian moonlight, held by a British officer who believes World War II is being fought too quietly. What happens next defies every principle of modern warfare. 42 German soldiers surrendered to 2 men armed with nothing but medieval steel, raw audacity, and the theatrical genius of a commander who understood that terror is sharper than bullets. This is the story of how Captain Jack Churchill proved that in war, the most devastating weapon isn't firepower. It's the absolute conviction that you've already won. September 8, 1943, 2 hours past midnight, the village of Pigoletti, Italy. The smell reached Captain Jack Churchill before the sight did, that particular combination of turned earth, machine oil, and nervous German tobacco that marked an enemy observation post. He crouched in the shadows of a collapsed stone wall, his left hand resting on the pommel of his Scottish broadsword, his right hand raised to halt Corporal Ruffle 3 paces behind him. The weapon at his side was not a prop. The 36-inch blade had been forged in 1899, purchased by Churchill from a Glasgow antique dealer for the price of a week's officer's pay, sharpened by his own hand on a whetstone he carried in his pack, and it had already tasted blood on the beaches of Norway and the cliffs of Vagsø. In his webbing, Churchill carried exactly 6 rounds for his sidearm. He had no intention of firing a single one. Above them, on the terraced hillside where olive groves gave way to scrub and limestone outcroppings, the German Wehrmacht had established observation post 17, a position that commanded a clear view of the valley below, where Allied forces were attempting to break out from the Salerno beachhead. Intelligence reports estimated 12 to 15 enemy soldiers equipped with mortars, machine guns, and direct communication to artillery batteries that had been making life exceptionally unpleasant for British and American units attempting to advance inland. The standard tactical approach would have been simple: call in artillery, suppress the position, send in a company-strength assault under covering fire, accept 10 to 20% casualties, secure the objective by dawn. Clean, predictable, loud. Churchill had other ideas. He turned his head fractionally, catching Ruffle's eye in the darkness. The corporal was 22 years old, a baker's son from Somerset who had joined No. 2 Commando because he wanted to do something more than march in circles. What he had gotten instead was assignment as Batman to a commanding officer who played bagpipes on the battlefield, carried a longbow alongside his rifle, and had once volunteered for a mission by asking, "Has anyone in this room the faintest idea how to attack with cold steel?" Churchill raised 3 fingers, 3 minutes, then pointed to his sword. Ruffle's eyes widened fractionally, but he nodded. By now, he understood that arguing with Mad Jack was less productive than arguing with artillery fire. The nickname had started as mockery, evolved into respect, and finally settled into something approaching reverence among the men who served under him. Captain John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, born September 16, 1906, educated at King William's College on the Isle of Man, former actor in minor films, champion archer, motorcycle enthusiast, and practitioner of what he called ungentlemanly warfare, had developed a philosophy of combat that would have seemed perfectly reasonable to a medieval knight, but appeared completely insane to a modern military establishment obsessed with firepower, suppression, and the industrial efficiency of killing. "Any officer who goes into action without his sword," Churchill had declared to a bemused briefing room before the Norway campaign, "is improperly dressed." He meant it literally. The transformation of Jack Churchill from eccentric peacetime soldier to legendary warrior had occurred not through formal military education, but through a kind of instinctive understanding of human psychology that would have fascinated military theorists if any of them had taken time to study his methods. While the British Army spent millions of pounds perfecting the science of indirect fire, combined arms coordination, and the application of overwhelming force, Churchill had arrived at a different conclusion. Most human beings, even trained soldiers, will surrender to confidence more readily than they'll resist firepower. He had tested this theory on the beaches of Norway in 1940, when he'd led a raid armed with a longbow and killed a German sentry with an arrow through the throat, the only recorded longbow kill of World War II. He had refined it at Vagso in 1941, where he'd led charges while playing March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes, a tactic that so confused German defenders that many surrendered without fighting, unable to process the cognitive dissonance of a British officer treating combat as theatrical performance. But Pigoletti would be his masterpiece. The Battle of Salerno had begun 9 days earlier, when Allied forces launched Operation Avalanche, an amphibious assault designed to establish a beachhead south of Naples and open the road to Rome. The landings had been opposed with savage intensity. German commanders, anticipating the assault, had positioned multiple divisions in the hills overlooking the beaches. The result had been carnage, landing craft destroyed before reaching shore, artillery fire that caught troops exposed on open beaches, counterattacks that nearly drove Allied forces back into the sea. By mid-September, the situation remained precarious. The beachhead was secured but shallow, barely 10 miles deep at its widest point. Every attempt to advance inland was met with withering fire from German positions in the high ground. Observation posts like the one at Pigoletti were the eyes of the German artillery system, calling down fire with devastating accuracy on any Allied movement they could observe. Number 2, Commando had been tasked with eliminating these observation posts. The job was critical, dangerous, and expected to be expensive in casualties. Churchill saw it as an opportunity for theater. He moved forward now, leaving Ruffle at the rallying point with instructions whispered so softly they were barely distinguishable from wind through olive branches. When you hear shouting, bring rope and look fierce. The approach took 20 minutes of movement so careful that Churchill's breath seemed louder than his footfalls. He had learned this kind of patience hunting deer in the Scottish Highlands, where a single careless sound meant failure, and he had perfected it in commando training, where instructors taught men to become shadows with purpose. The ground was treacherous, loose stones that could shift underfoot, dry branches that would crack like gunshots, exposed positions where moonlight would silhouette him against the sky. Churchill navigated it all with the focused intensity of a predator closing on prey, his senses heightened to preternatural sharpness. He could hear the German sentries before he could see them. The shuffle of boots on stone, the click of a rifle bolt being checked for the 20th time, the low murmur of conversation in a language Churchill understood better than most British officers, having spent time in Germany before the war as a motorcycle racer and enthusiastic tourist. One of them was complaining about the food, another was talking about a girl in Munich. Normal soldiers doing a normal job who had no reason to expect that death, or something stranger, was approaching with a medieval sword in its hand. Churchill paused 15 feet from the first-sentry position, concealed behind a limestone outcropping. He could see the man clearly now, young, maybe 19. Wehrmacht tunic unbuttoned at the collar despite regulations, rifle slung over one shoulder in a way that suggested boredom rather than alertness. The observation post itself was a textbook position, sandbags arranged to provide protection while maintaining clear sight lines to the valley, a mortar emplacement visible 30 yards beyond, and what looked like a communications post further back where the faint glow of a shielded lamp suggested someone was awake. The standard assault would be to throw grenades, rush the position under covering fire, clear it trench by trench. Even if successful, it would alert every German position within a mile radius. The enemy would fade back, re-establish elsewhere, and the deadly game would begin again. Churchill drew his broadsword with a whisper of steel against leather. The young German sentry heard something, a shift in the night sounds, perhaps, or the instinct that tells prey when a predator is near. He turned, mouth opening to call a warning, and found himself staring at a figure that should not have existed on a 20th century battlefield. A British officer, face blackened with burnt cork, wearing a commando beret and battle dress, holding a Highland broadsword that caught moonlight along 3 feet of sharpened steel. For a critical instant, the sentry's mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. The cognitive dissonance was too great. This was 1943. Men fought with rifles, machine guns, grenades, artillery, tanks, aircraft. They did not materialize from darkness holding medieval weapons like apparitions from Germanic legend. Churchill lunged forward with the speed of a fencer, and suddenly the blade was at the young man's throat, pressing just hard enough to dimple skin without breaking it, and Churchill's voice was in his ear, speaking German with an upper-class accent that made the words somehow more terrifying. "Schweig still, oder du bist tot. Be silent, or you are dead." The rifle clattered to the stones. The sentry's hands rose slowly, trembling. "Walk," Churchill whispered, "toward your comrades. Natural pace. If you call a warning, I'll open your throat before the sound leaves your lips." It was a bluff. Churchill had no intention of killing a prisoner, but the young German didn't know that, and in the darkness, with a sword at his neck and a madman's voice in his ear, he believed absolutely that he was one sound away from death. They moved together, predator and prey, toward the next position. What happened over the next 30 minutes was a masterclass in psychological warfare that would never be taught at staff colleges because it violated every principle of modern tactics. Churchill used his first prisoner as both shield and psychological weapon, positioning the terrified young German in front of him as they approached each successive position, the sword always visible, always pressed close enough to communicate threat. And his voice, Churchill's voice, was critical, delivering commands in German with such absolute authority that men accustomed to obeying orders found themselves obeying reflexively before their conscious minds could engage. "Ruhe," silence. "Hände hoch," hands up. "Waffen fallen lassen," drop your weapons. And they did, not all at once, not without hesitation, but one by one, as Churchill and his growing collection of prisoners moved through the German position like a theatrical production where everyone had been given their role and no one dared improvate. Wehrmacht soldiers surrendered to a man with a sword. The brilliance of Churchill's approach was that it exploited multiple psychological vulnerabilities simultaneously. First, the cognitive dissonance. The utter impossibility of what was happening made rational assessment nearly impossible. Second, the assumption of superior force. Surely no one would attempt this unless they had overwhelming backup ready to intervene. Third, the authority in Churchill's voice and manner, which communicated absolute confidence and made resistance feel futile rather than heroic. And fourth, most critically, Churchill understood something about soldiers that philosophers and military theorists had known since ancient times. Most men in combat are desperately looking for permission not to fight, given a plausible reason to surrender with honor, the belief that they were surrounded, outmaneuvered, facing impossible odds. Most would take it. By the time Churchill reached the mortar position, he had 17 prisoners walking in front of him in a column, and his voice had become an instrument of command that seemed to reach into men's spines and override their conscious will. When 3 German gunners looked up from their mortar pit to see a British officer with a sword herding their comrades like sheep, and Churchill barked, "Raus, sofort!" Out, immediately. They climbed out of the pit with their hands raised. Corporal Ruffle appeared then, right on cue, carrying rope, and looking exactly as fierce as a Somerset baker's son could manage, which was apparently fierce enough because the Germans assumed he was the vanguard of a larger force. Churchill had him tie the prisoners while maintaining his theatrical command of the situation, issuing orders in a mix of German and English that kept everyone slightly off balance and focused on compliance rather than resistance. The mortar squad commander, an under-officier with decorations that suggested experience on the Eastern Front, tried to organize resistance once, reaching for his sidearm with the intention of rallying his men. Churchill moved with the speed that years of fencing practice had ingrained, the broadsword flashing in a horizontal arc that stopped 1 inch from the under-officier's throat. "Your choice," Churchill said in perfect German. "Die uselessly or live to see your family again. We have you surrounded. Your position is compromised. Resistance is pointless." The lie was so confidently delivered that it became functionally true. The under-official's hand moved away from his weapon. He raised both hands and stepped into the column of prisoners. By 0300 hours, Churchill and Ruffle were walking back toward British lines with 42 German prisoners, a captured mortar with ammunition, maps showing defensive positions throughout the sector, and a captured German officer's binoculars that Churchill would use for the rest of the war. Not a single shot had been fired. The entire operation had been accomplished with medieval weaponry, psychological manipulation, and theatrical audacity that would have seemed absurd if it hadn't succeeded so completely. The American units holding the perimeter stared in disbelief as the column approached through the morning darkness. A lieutenant from Texas, who had been expecting to hear the sound of a firefight on the hills and was instead confronted with what appeared to be a British officer herding dozens of German prisoners with a sword, demanded to know what in God's name had just happened. "We took a walk," Churchill replied cheerfully, "and made some new friends." The debriefing that followed was complicated by the fact that no one in the command structure quite believed the operation had happened as reported. The intelligence officers wanted to know how many men Churchill had actually used. The answer, too, was rejected as impossible. The tactical officers wanted to know what supporting fire had been called in. The answer, none, was met with skepticism. Eventually, the German prisoners themselves were interrogated, and their consistent accounts of being captured by a madman with a sword forced the British command to accept that Captain Churchill had, in fact, accomplished a mission expected to cost 20 casualties with 0 friendly losses and a medieval weapon. The German officers particularly seemed traumatized by the experience. One, when asked how he had been captured, replied with the dazed certainty of a man whose worldview had been shattered. "He came out of the darkness with a sword. We thought we were surrounded by hundreds. How do you fight a man who brings a sword to a war?" The honest answer, which no one in the German command structure wanted to acknowledge, was that you couldn't. Not because the sword was an effective weapon. In purely material terms, it was ridiculous, but because the psychology of a man who would carry a sword into modern combat was so far outside normal parameters that it created a reality distortion field around him. Churchill didn't just fight battles, he rewrote their psychological context. The capture at Pigoletti was not, as some accounts would later suggest, a lucky anomaly. It was the perfected expression of a philosophy Churchill had been developing throughout the war. That combat was as much theater as tactics, that confidence was as powerful as firepower, and that the human mind under stress would default to obedience when confronted with sufficiently overwhelming authority. In the years after the war, military historians would struggle to incorporate Churchill's exploits into their analyses of effective tactics. The problem was that his methods were not replicable by normal officers. They required a unique combination of absolute fearlessness, theatrical skill, linguistic ability, psychological insight, and the kind of creative audacity that military establishments spend most of their time trying to suppress. Churchill himself was untroubled by academic debates about his methods. When asked years later how he had accomplished the capture, he replied with characteristic bluntness, "I found that people will obey anyone who shouts loud, clear orders at them, especially if you're holding a sword. There's something about cold steel that makes men remember their mortality." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Also, fighting a war properly requires style. Any bloody fool can carry a rifle. It takes a gentleman to carry a sword." The tactical impact of the Pigoletti operation extended far beyond the 42 prisoners and captured equipment. The elimination of Observation Post 17 created a gap in German defensive intelligence that allowed Allied forces to advance 3 miles inland without the coordinated artillery fire that had been devastating earlier attacks. The maps captured from the German officer revealed defensive positions and troop concentrations that intelligence had been unable to confirm, enabling targeting decisions that saved countless lives. But the psychological impact was perhaps even more significant. Word of the capture spread through German units in the sector, carried by the particular kind of rumor that flourishes in combat zones where men are desperate for any information about the enemy they face. The story grew in the telling. One British officer became 10. The sword became multiple weapons. The night assault became a daylight raid. But the core remained consistent. There was a British commander who fought like a man from another century, who could not be understood through normal tactical analysis, and who represented something deeply unsettling about their enemy's willingness to embrace methods that defied rational military doctrine. For Allied forces, Churchill became something between mascot and myth, a living embodiment of the idea that audacity could triumph over material superiority, that individual genius could overcome institutional limitations, and that the war they were fighting, increasingly industrial, increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly a matter of logistics and firepower, could still have room for human heroism on a personal scale. The American soldiers particularly were fascinated by Churchill. They had grown up on movies about frontier heroes and lone cowboys, and here was a British officer who seemed to have stepped out of those narratives, transposed into a European setting. When Churchill visited American units after Pigoletti, he was treated with the kind of celebrity usually reserved for movie stars, asked to pose for photographs with his sword, requested to tell and retell the story of the capture. He obliged, of course. Churchill understood that his value extended beyond tactical effectiveness. He was a propaganda asset, a morale booster, a reminder that individual courage still mattered in an age of mass mechanized warfare. He played the role with the same commitment he brought to combat, because he understood that in war, as in theater, the performance was inseparable from the reality. September 19, 1943 became the date on which military theorists would later mark a peculiar footnote in the history of modern warfare. The last recorded successful combat operation conducted primarily with medieval weaponry. But for the men who witnessed it, who served under Churchill, who heard the stories filtering through the units fighting their way up the Italian peninsula, Pigoletti represented something more profound than a tactical curiosity. It represented the enduring power of the human element in warfare, the idea that psychology, creativity, and individual audacity could still matter in an age when military effectiveness was increasingly measured in tonnages of steel and expenditures of ammunition. Churchill's sword, ridiculous as it appeared in tactical doctrine, had accomplished what weeks of artillery bombardment and infantry assaults had failed to achieve. It had broken the enemy's will to resist without destroying their bodies, captured them without killing them, and demonstrated that the most devastating weapon in warfare remained as it had always been, the human mind's capacity for innovation and intimidation. The 42 German prisoners sitting in POW camps scattered across southern Italy had time to reflect on their capture. Most would eventually admit, in the carefully casual way that soldiers discuss their defeats, that they had not been defeated by superior force or tactics, but by something stranger, by the confrontation with a form of warfare they could not categorize, led by a man who seemed to have imported the psychology of single combat into an age of industrial killing. One prisoner, interviewed years after the war by a historian researching unconventional warfare, described the experience with lingering bewilderment. We had been trained to face tanks, artillery, aerial bombardment, all the terrible weapons of modern war. But we had no training for a man with a sword who acted as though he owned the night. When he appeared, my first thought was that I had gone insane. My second thought was that surrender was the only rational response to insanity. It was, in its way, the highest compliment one professional soldier could pay another. The acknowledgement that Churchill had so completely dominated the psychological dimension of combat that resistance had seemed not just futile, but somehow inappropriate, a violation of the rules that Churchill himself had established the moment he emerged from the darkness with steel in his hand and absolute conviction in his voice. Churchill would continue fighting until the war's end, always with his sword, always with his bagpipes, always with the theatrical approach to combat that made him simultaneously one of the British Army's most decorated officers and one of its most eccentric. He survived the war barely after being captured by the SS in Yugoslavia and escaping from a POW camp, and lived until 1996, long enough to see his exploits analyzed by military historians, celebrated in documentaries, and incorporated into the mythology of World War II as examples of individual heroism in an age of mass mechanized warfare. But Pigoletti remained his masterpiece, the operation where all his theories about psychological warfare, the power of confidence, and the theatrical dimension of combat came together in perfect execution. 2 men, 1 sword, 0 casualties, 42 prisoners. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was, by every standard of modern military tactics, ridiculous. It was also genius. The sword captain Jack Churchill carried up that Italian hillside on September 8, 1943, now resides in a British museum, displayed alongside the bagpipes he played on battlefields from Norway to Yugoslavia. Visitors pause before it, reading the placard that describes its use, and almost always react with the same mixture of disbelief and admiration that the German prisoners felt when they first saw it emerge from darkness. Because the sword represents something that military establishments have always struggled to incorporate into their doctrines, the idea that warfare, for all its terrible efficiency and industrial scale, remains at its core a human activity, subject to psychology as much as physics, vulnerable to audacity as much as firepower, and capable of being transformed by individuals who refuse to accept the limitations that conventional thinking imposes. Churchill understood this instinctively. While military theorists debated the optimal caliber for infantry weapons and the proper ratio of artillery tubes to frontage covered, he was perfecting the art of making enemy soldiers surrender by shouting at them confidently while holding an anachronistic weapon. While staff officers planned operations measured in divisions and corps, he was leading 2-man raids armed with swords. And while the industrial machinery of modern warfare ground forward, consuming lives and resources in its terrible efficiency, Churchill proved that there was still room, just barely, just occasionally, for a gentleman with a sword to walk into the darkness and emerge with victory achieved not through the weight of metal, but through the force of personality. The lesson of Pigoletti, if there is one, is not that modern armies should abandon rifles for broadswords. It's that the human elements of warfare, courage, creativity, psychological insight, and the kind of audacity that borders on madness remain as powerful as they were when combat was conducted with bronze and iron rather than steel and explosives. Churchill's sword didn't defeat Germany, but on one night in September 1943, in a small Italian village whose name most people have never heard, it defeated 42 German soldiers without firing a shot, and in doing so proved that even in the age of mechanized warfare, the most devastating weapon remains the one that strikes at the human mind rather than the human body. The blade in the darkness, the voice in the night, the absolute confidence that transforms theater into reality and makes the impossible merely improbable. That was Mad Jack's gift. That was his genius. That was Pigoletti.